Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. Our webinar presentation by Dr. Eric Jackson is entitled The Diversity of Our Nation, Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration. Excuse me. This webinar is brought to you by the National Council for History Education with the generous support of a Technologies Impact in American History grant from the Library of Congress. The National Council for History Education provides professional and intellectual leadership to foster an engaged community committed to the teaching, learning, and appreciation of diverse histories. We have a variety of professional activities for anyone interested in history and how we teach it, including webinars, colloquia, professional development, online trainings, and conversations with noted historians and history educators. If you like what you're seeing from us, we encourage you to become a member of National Council for History Education. You can do so by visiting us on the web at www.ncheteach.org and click on Join. Some guidelines for tonight's presentation. If you're comfortable doing so, please include your name and location in the chat box, as well as any comments that you have along the way. It goes without saying to please keep your comments appropriate and germane to Dr. Jackson's presentation. If you have questions as Dr. Jackson gives his presentation, please put those in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Following Dr. Jackson's presentation, we'll try to answer as many questions as possible from participants. We are pleased that this event is being live streamed for closed captioning. If you need closed captioning services, simply click on live on custom live stream service and view stream. If you need a direct link, you'll notice that one will be provided in the chat prior to the beginning of Dr. Jackson's talk. As an introduction, by way of introduction, as professor of history with almost 29 years of academic experience at the university level, Dr. Eric R. Jackson has taught numerous classes in the fields of American and African American history, race relations, and peace studies. Dr. Jackson is also published in a wide array of books, book reviews, articles, and in many local, regional, national, and international journals, such as the Journal of African American History, the Journal of Negro Education, Ohio History, the International Journal of World Peace, and the Journal of Pan-African Studies. With over 50 publications, Dr. Jackson's most recent projects include a book on the subject of this talk, Let Freedom Ring for Everyone. He also is the book review editor of the Journal of Pan-African Studies and a member of the Boone County, Kentucky Historic Preservation Review Board and the Kentucky Historic Preservation Review Board. We're delighted for Dr. Jackson to be joining us this evening. Dr. Jackson, welcome.
Thank you for the introduction. So let me get started. All right. So let me give you some background here with my presentation. So this concept of, or this topic of the diversity of our nation, race, ethnicity, and immigration kind of came to me probably about 4 or 5 years ago, if not longer. And what I was thinking about before I started diving into this topic and how one would teach it is that I wanted to think about a way that we as a nation could figure out a way to take a hard topic or topics such as race, ethnicity, and immigration, which is the foundation of our nation, and bring back what I call some type of civility in our discussion of a topic or topics that is wrapped around our nation and has many different angles. We're in a period of time today in 2021 where everybody's dug in, or a lot of people's dug in on a particular side. But for me, as I conceptualized this many years ago before it kind of escalated to this point, is how do we understand each other, and how do we have compassion for each other, and how do we create a nation that's based on diversity, that's rooted in the concepts of race, ethnicity, and immigration? So the 3 questions I asked myself before I even got into constructing this particular presentation and a book that's linked to this presentation are these 3 basic questions. 1, why do we need to have civility and tough conversations? So that would be question 1. Why do we need to have civility and tough conversations? The second question I asked myself as I moved into this space is, what do the topics of immigration, why is the topic of immigration so important to the United States? And lastly, the third question I asked myself is, what are some of the key linkage between the topics of race, ethnicity, and immigration? So what I want to talk about here is, how do you teach these topics? How do you frame these topics? And how did I do this when I created a volume that focused on these topics? So I usually, when I teach these topics in a classroom and on different levels, as I try to find some sort of some technology or video aids to help me in this process. And usually I have films or documentaries that help me walk through that process. For example, and again, this is a book that my presentation is based on. This came out last year. Let Freedom Ring: For Everyone, the Diversity of Our Nation, from Cognitive Press. And so one of the ways I kind of dove into this concept of race is, maybe back in 2016, 2017, I was involved in a film project titled Liberty and Slavery that talked about the founding of the United States and this complex linkage between the founding fathers talking about liberty of our nation, but at the same time grappling with this concept of slavery. So what I want to do here is first show a clip from that documentary. I think.
Dr. Jackson, we're just seeing a gray screen. You might need to stop share and then reshare.
Hold on. So hold on here. Stop share. What is going on here? Hold on. How do you stop share? Here we go. Stop share.
There you go.
All right. So let's try this again. So here, we want to go here. What are you saying now?
It is one of the most vexing questions.
You're all set, thanks.
In the Revolutionary era, why so many of our great founders were simultaneously slaveholders.
The founders are the most creative political generation in American history. Here are these great men who created the nation, and yet they have blood on their hands.
So the truth is that among the major Southern founders, most of them are slaveholders. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, George Mason, on and on and on.
The American Revolution is the world's first popular revolution based on these fundamental ideas of liberty.
And how can people who spoke words like all men are created equal still hold hundreds of thousands of people in bondage?
We need to put ourselves in their shoes and ask ourselves, could they have done more?
Slavery was big business. An average field hand would sell for about $25,000 to $40,000 in today's money.
And it was the Deep South that said, if you don't keep slavery in documents like the Constitution, we're not going to sign it.
We can look at slavery as something of which to be ashamed, or we can look at it as something to grow beyond.
George Washington looked very energetically for a way to finance the emancipation of his slaves. And for a variety of reasons, he couldn't do it.
Especially as Madison is getting older, and he always talks about slavery. He is literally haunted by it.
It shouldn't just be seen as
a simplistic story of hypocrisy that goes wrong.
They started the conversation about liberty, equality, justice, and freedom. They didn't end the conversation, they started it. So let me go back to this section here. PowerPoint. So the next film I want to show is a clip from a Hollywood production of Jackie Robinson called 42. So for those folks who know me, I'm a big baseball fan, and for a lot of reasons. I played the game, but for more important reasons for this particular discussion is it encompassed so much about the history of the United States, particularly with these three concepts of race, ethnicity, immigration, because this game of baseball kind of defines the United States, both the good and bad, both the positive and negative, the contradictions, the struggles, the perseverance, the understanding, the lack of understanding, the things we wrestle with when we talk about race, ethnicity, and immigration is embedded in this game, and it kind of defines the country. So when I talk about this subject matter, I use this particular film as a way to introduce that these three concepts permeates who we are as Americans, who we are in some ways as human beings, but it also gives us an opportunity to discuss this in a sports way. And a lot of times it kind of breaks down the barriers that kind of divides us more than brings us together. So let me start this film or clip from 42. Okay. Are you seeing it screen again or no?
You just need to reshare now.
Okay, hold on. So I need to stop this, break this down, go here.
Make sure you click those two boxes.
Got the two boxes, clicked again. All right, here and here. And where did I go with that film? Okay, so here it is. It's here. How about now?
My daddy left us.
Thanks.
I was only 6 months older than you are now. I don't remember him. You will remember me.
Jackie Robinson, a black man in white baseball.
I want you to know I'm there for you.
In my heart.
Think about the abuse that he's gonna take.
Your enemy will be out in force, but you cannot meet him on his own low ground.
What you gonna do if one of these pitchers throws through your head?
I'll duck.
Mark my words and circle this day. Negroes are gonna run the white man straight out of baseball.
This ain't the America I know. You hear me?
If they knew you, they would be ashamed.
If Robinson can help us win, then he is gonna play on this ball club. You don't belong here, and you never will.
Get off the field. Brooklyn Dodgers ain't changing our way of living.
You're wearing me down.
You are not the only one with something at stake here.
You want a player who doesn't have the guts to fight back?
No, I want a player who's got the guts not to fight back.
You give me a uniform. You give me a number on my back. I'll give you the guts.
I father, I Brooklyn Dodger them. I jack, I rob, I sin. Oh man, I'm Jackie Robinson. Set when I run base, I dodge the pen.
I'm just a ball player.
You're a hero.
Why don't you look in the mirror? This is a white man's game. I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here.
I'm a Brooklyn boy, I may take some getting used to.
Maybe tomorrow we'll all wear 42.
So let me go back to the PowerPoint here. So what do we do here? So when we're researching these concepts of race, ethnicity, and immigration in the United States, what would one do when you're trying to teach this or have this conversation based on civility? What do we do when we try to teach about these concepts of race, ethnicity, and immigration in the United States? Where do we go? And number three, how do we have the conversation? How do we frame this conversation? It's not going away. So how do we frame this conversation about race, ethnicity, and immigration in the history of the United States? And lastly, how do I teach about these concepts of race, ethnicity, and immigration in the United States? So the first thing you have to do is, for me, is you have to agree on some basic concepts or theories. Basic concepts and theories such as race itself is a social construct, meaning, as I use in my class and examples, if you have little kids, they're not born seeing people through racial lenses. They play with kids because they're kids. They play. And race is a social construct that they learn as they grow. And so the first thing you have to keep in mind is race is not this unmittable concept that just kind of falls out of the sky. It's a learned behavior and you're socialized into it. And this type of race could turn into what's called institutional racism, which has a power component. And then you have these concepts, this concept called whiteness that a society kind of buys into. It's sort of like historically when you have immigrant coming to the United States, say particularly the Irish, when they migrated to the United States. Initially, they were looked upon as second-class citizens or on an equal non-positive playing field as African Americans. But slowly over time, this concept of race kind of moved them and they kind of moved into this new structure. And thirdly, racial and ethnic inequalities kind of permeates this discussion. So my point being, when you're going to have this conversation or when one teaches about concept of race, ethnicity, and immigration, you have to agree upon these basic concepts and theories of race as a social construct, that it can manifest itself into some type of institutional racism. This concept of whiteness, this kind of permeates the history of the United States for different racial and ethnic groups. And race and ethnicity kind of developed over time into dividing people up and developing into what's called inequality. So let's kind of drill down to this social concept of race. So these are three basic themes or three basic theories that's connected to the social construct of race. The idea of race as a social construct has been accepted by most scholars. There's different racial classifications. And I'm not trying to read this to you, but the point I'm trying to make here is that race as a social construct permeates the history of the United States from its core, has manifested itself over time in different constructs, impacts people differently based on how they fall in racial classifications, empowers certain groups and disempowers other groups based on where they fall in these racial classifications. And it's an historical concept that has consequences, ideas, and events that associate with this racial construct. And again, to drill down on this concept of institutional racism, it was responsible for the enslavement of African Americans, the creation of reservations, For Native peoples, racial segregation, residential schools for Native Americans, and the use of internment camps during World War II. So institutional racism usually has a power construct involved. It doesn't just float in the air. It's structured in a way that usually does more harm than good. But it is based on a social construct of race that has manifested itself into a power structure that stratifies people based on their race, their ethnicity, creates economic disparities, employment disparities, housing disparities, education disparities, healthcare disparities, you name it, it's there with this structure of institutional racism. This is not to say you shouldn't have the discussion about it. The issue is, how do you have this discussion about these systems that exist and have it from a civility perspective and reach some conclusion? And I'll talk about that towards the end of this presentation. How do you move forward and progress? How do you move forward and give people hope? How do you move forward and we come together as you're teaching this without staying in this place of negativity? And so the point here at this juncture is just to introduce some basic concepts of the basic concept of institutional racism that you have to agree upon exists and has manifested itself over time. And again, institutional racism is different than bigotry or racial bias because it exists in a systematic structure where policies and practices have been institutionalized. Again, that's not to say, and again, I'll get to this by the end of the talk, that's not to say that these institutions are not movable. It's just you have to have the conversation about it. You have to reach some consensus of it that exists, and then you move into teaching about it, and then you move into how to break it down. And so that's all the steps or reasons why I kind of put this talk together. And the book that's connected to this talk is that you have to agree upon some known truth. You have to deal with those known truths. You have to break those down, and you have to give people the tools to give them hope to change that reality, because they're not unmovable objects. Even this concept of whiteness is a social construct. Again, we are not born looking at each other through racial lenses. This is learned behavior, and it manifests itself into institutions, into organizations, based on historical precedents, into court systems, into schooling. In this particular example, I talk about, for example, point number 3, such classifications have been fortified by what's IQ tests. For example, back in the 90s, there was a book that came out by a Harvard scholar called The Bell Curve that talked about certain groups of people just based on their race don't do well on standardized IQ tests. And so how do you interrogate that kind of analysis? And if you don't, what does that mean? And so these concepts are not immovable. It's just you have to agree upon them, analyze them, break them down, figure out how to move forward, and make sure after you have these conversations, you give people enough tools to have hope that they can change their landscape. They can change the culture. But if you don't have these conversations based on agreeable truth, you kind of are stuck in this conversation that goes nowhere, or you just don't have the conversations and we just stay in our kind of different divisions or tribal attitudes in a way that's not productive. And so racial and ethnic inequality, again, based on those social construct of race, manifests itself in this way also. Again, I'm not necessarily trying to read PowerPoints, but I'm just kind of give you summaries that racial and ethnic inequality seeks to define and uncover advantages and disadvantages of various ethnic groups. And so again, it manifests itself in different ways in housing, ownership, poverty rates, employment, unemployment rates, healthcare system, educational facilities, and the list goes on and on and on. So those racial constructs also can manifest themselves into what's called tools of domination and divisions, which can be broken down into these 5 concepts or main areas: stereotypes, criminal justice systems, health and healthcare, politics and political systems, and educational structures. So let's talk about stereotypes. So usually stereotypes are based in some type of a kernel of truth, real or unreal, that gives people a way to generalize a group. It makes the complex easy to generalize. So you just take one kernel of truth and you generalize about a group of people. You kind of exacerbate the generalities about a group of people, and that's how you stereotype them. So you don't talk about the complexities within a group. You just take a kernel of truth and you just kind of generalize them. Then stereotypes are powerful too, because they play out in the system. They play out in a way that people will say things that they may not mean, that certain people look this way or like this kind of things, or they don't talk about the complexities. Here, there's a statement that stereotypes usually play out in a powerful role in how people come to view dominant and non-dominant groups. Most people associate positive and negative attributes based on stereotypes. Again, all of this is learned behavior. We're not born just looking for stereotypes. You learn this stuff in structures. And again, if you agree upon these things exist, you figure out how to break them down, understand how they function, come back together as a whole, give people hope, give people a way to interrogate them, and we move forward as a nation together. These concepts also are manifest themselves in systems such as criminal justice system. For example, the relationship between police, the entire criminal justice system, non-dominant groups, particularly those groups that reside in inner city, is primarily characterized by hostility and warlike mentality. My argument usually is this is a generalization and a stereotype, because most people support the criminal justice system and want safe neighborhoods. They want police. They just want them to be connected more to their communities. And so, again, interrogating generalizations, interrogating concepts that the criminal justice system should be totally eradicated. Does it have problems? Indeed it does. But how do we come together as a nation? Again, understanding how to agree upon certain truth, interrogate these things that have a negative impact on our nation, come back together as a whole, and move forward together as opposed to separate. And again, in a large measure, the criminal justice system, some folks argue, reflects century-long racial prejudice, anger, and racism, which has a historical truth to it. Indeed, it does. But again, the point is not to stay in these historical constructs forever, is to understand them. And I keep using the word interrogate, breaking down, and bringing folks back together to figure out how to move forward and give people hope that you can move in a direction that brings folks together, as opposed to continuing to not talk about them or just stay in our same kind of separate communities, consciously or not. As we see today, health and healthcare is an issue. We're still in the pandemic stage. I've had this conversation numerous times that what the pandemic did, among numerous things, is just to highlight the racial disparities in the healthcare industry. If you talk about how people trust or don't trust the healthcare industry, how people talk to doctors, don't talk to doctors, the number of doctors of different racial and ethnic groups who are there or not there. And so it brought to the forefront these disparities in health and healthcare. And so these 3 points I mentioned here, the primary barriers to the access to proper and adequate healthcare for persons of color was already there before the pandemic hit. The inability to pay for healthcare services, the lack of transportation to healthcare facilities, inadequate care, the lack of clear healthcare treatment plans, all of these things were already there. And the stage we're in now is just exacerbated these things that had been there for decades, if not centuries. Again, you interrogate these concepts and these systems is already there, figure out what we need to come together as a whole. How do you move forward and give people hope that we can move forward coming together as opposed to staying separate? Political identification is another way. People tend to associate group loyalty to certain groups of people. Ethnic and racial groups also associated with public policies. Political parties rely on playing that card of dividing people based on race, ethnicity, and using immigration as a way to divide people as opposed to bringing them together. But again, if you understand how these systems work, you kind of break them down, bring people together to interrogate what's going on, cross-racial and ethnic divisions come together, give people hope and strategies, and then you kind of change the structure. It sounds easy, but obviously it's not. Education systems also follows the same way. Different ways that people live. They talk about certain different groups, discrimination, for example, point number 2, discrimination in educational institution and educational opportunities is primary method in which socioeconomic status of minority groups are reinforced. Getting folks into schools and schools that work and function equally, K through 12, university levels, all of it's part of system that it's used to empower people or to stereotype people and not give them an opportunity. But educational institutions tends to reflect income levels. Usually the more education you have, the more opportunities you have to increase income levels. And so that's a linchpin that has permeated how the United States has functioned since its inception. So let me slow down here and see if we have any questions in the chat. Anybody have any questions so far? Well, let me continue on. So ethnicity and race in the United States. Usually these were the what I call the older groups of people that folks understood from an ethnicity and race perspective, probably up until the 1960s. African Americans, Native peoples, Jewish Americans, and white ethnic Americans from different groups. You can also include Asian Americans, Mexican Americans, and Cuban Americans in that same groups. These are people are up into the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Most people were familiar with these ethnic and racial groups that permeated the history of the United States. how the United States function, kind of embedded in the story of the United States, played a part in every single aspect of the United States, from building of schools and railroads to building our country, coming through Ellis Island, creating ethnic enclaves in New York and major metropolitan areas and smaller cities. So most people are familiar with these particular racial and ethnic groups. In 2017, however, 14% of the immigration population of the United States were defined by what were called the new immigrant wave. The new immigrant wave included Arab Americans, Brazilian Americans, Haitian Americans, Nigerian Americans. So you have this new wave of immigrants, and this does not exhaust the list. These are just some of the major groups. And again, you're talking Arab Americans, Brazilian Americans, Haitian Americans, Nigerian Americans. Some people even argue you have a new wave of Cuban Americans that you could classify as this new wave. You have an entire group of Hispanic Americans, which includes a diverse array of people from Central and South America, depending on where they reside, migrate to the United States in huge numbers. So those are what's called the new immigrant groups. So the question becomes, as a nation, number one, how do we talk about immigration, linking it to race and ethnicity, using civility as our model? And civility I define as the formal way to talk about different perspectives with courtesy and with kindness as we walk through these hard subjects. So you're trying to talk through these hard subject matters in a humane way, in a way that helps folks understand that civility is the key of understanding, of us coming together and understanding how do we walk through this new wave of immigration, and how does that work, and how do we do it as a nation? Because immigration is the foundation of the United States. Again, reaching back to that whole Jackie Robinson film 42. What I do when I show that film also is I show that over time, that baseball itself becomes an immigrant sport a lot of times. Now, for example, one could argue, and I teach a class on the history of baseball, to upwards of 20 to 25% of major league players are from Latin America, Central America, and South America. And so the immigrant experience is codified or can be looked through the lens of baseball, understanding how does that work? Because they don't see themselves when they're on a team from an individual place. They see themselves as a team, as pulling the same direction of understanding difference of languages and culture and music and food and clothing attire and history and family, but they're on the same team because sports develops teamwork. And so the point here that I'm trying to make is using baseball as a model, not to say that it's the end all, but it does give us a way to talk about new wave of immigration, concept of race, the concept of ethnicity, and gives us a different vantage point of understanding how we need to talk about it and deal with it in a different way that gives us civility of doing it in a more courteous way, in a more understanding way that will bring us into a new place where we're not just dehumanizing each other, that we're talking about this in a way that brings us together that where we can teach it in a way where folks understand that we're all part of the same boat. But again, getting back to this particular slide, this new wave of immigration by 2017 made up 14% of our entire immigration population. And so these are some more statistics. Percentage of population of people between 25 to 64 with at least an associate degree, and it breaks it down based on different races of people. So you have Latinos, here the national average is 21%, and it goes on the Indian Americans, African Americans, white Americans, and Asian Pacifics. And it breaks it down nationally. And these are examples of specific states I just chose randomly, examining places like Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. So there was no rhyme or reason why I chose those states. I just used them as examples that if you talk about education, obtainment, you could break down from an ethnic and racial and immigrant perspective what that means in the United States today. Another scale gives us an understanding of immigration reform by age, meaning that there's always been this push to reform the process of immigration in the history of the United States. It's probably been more exacerbated in the past 10 to 12 years. It's not going away. The question becomes, how do we talk about it based on the concept of civility? How do we understand how that works? How do we agree upon a policy that's inclusive as opposed to exclusive? How do we deal with understanding what folks are talking about when they talk about immigration in Texas as opposed to Florida? What types of folks are migrating to those different states? What does that mean for our nation? That people migrate to New York or California or New Mexico that's coming from different parts of Central and South America. How do we understand that in a more inclusive way? And what this chart shows that different people have different perspective based on their ages, whether they fall 18 to 29, 30 to 49, 50 to 64, or 65 plus. They have different perspectives. Because if you go down this first chart, different perspectives here, meaning 4%, and you go all the way up to here, 4% of all Americans, they fall into this category of refuse any immigrants from coming to the United States. And then you break it down here, 19% believe, identify, or deport them. You have 15%, and it breaks down, allow them here to become permanent legal residents, and 64% allow them a way to become citizens if they meet certain requirements. And then you start breaking it down in ages. And so this is what I mean, that the issue of race, the issue of ethnicity and immigration is a little more complex than people want to present it. And to have that discussion in a more civility way and bringing more understanding will bring us to a place where we can be more together than apart. Couple more slides. This one talks about, in this chart, immigration wave of the United States population near historic highs. You can see from this particular chart, one of the lowest points was during the 1970s. Between 2010 and 2018, it's almost as it was back here in the 1890s. It's just this new wave of immigration. So My point being is the concept and the topic of immigration, it's not going away anytime soon. Actually, it's part of the foundation of the United States itself. It's just the different wave of immigrants have changed over the years, from European immigrants to immigrants from Central and South America. I have a few more slides here. The charts talks about foreign-born population by region of birth, 1980 to 1990s, breaking it down from Europe to Canada, Mexico, other Latin American areas, Asia, Africa, and it changes over time from 1980 to 1990s. And again, my point being here again is the topic of immigration is not going away, actually becoming more sophisticated, and you can't solve it with band-aid approaches, slogans, public policy decisions that one shoe fits all. You have to have a deep dive and a deep understanding that not all immigrants function the same way and migrate to the United States for the same reasons. It's a little more complex than that. Also, keep in mind that immigration to the United States is different than immigration to our northern neighbor. Issues of race and ethnicity is different in the United States compared to Canada, for example. It's just different. It's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. And so here are some of the sources I used here. There's different websites. You have to do your research to agree upon certain truth and certain understandings and certain beliefs, and how do you come to some conclusions on what do we do as a nation to broach these topics, talk about it from a civil perspective, interrogate what has gone on historically, bring people together of like-minded, and come up with some decisions and some policies and some changes where we're all moving in the same direction, because at the end, we're in the same boat. Where do we go from here? That comes from a book that Dr. King wrote back in the 60s. Where do we go from here? Which is interesting. One of my colleagues and some of the past historians have called Dr. King one of the most important prophets in the history of the United States, which is interesting. But again, where do we go from here? I think where do we go from here is we have to be intentional about having these conversations about race, ethnicity, and immigration. We have to be strategic about having them. We have to understand the historical construct of them. We have to understand that race is a social construct, and we're not born seeing people in racial lenses. We learn that as a learned behavior, which means in some cases we can unlearn it. And we need to have these discussions from a civil, understanding, hopeful, bringing together perspective. And we also have to teach it that way. We have to teach these subject matter in a way that frames it in a way that people don't feel isolated or insulated. And it's not easy. If it was easy, as I tell teachers that I teach, and students who want to be teachers, if it was easy, it would be solved. And so we have to figure out a way to move together, because we're all in this boat together. And this is one of the reasons why I used on a lot of my slides this particular image. We're all in the same boat together. Thank you. Any questions?
Well, thank you, Dr. Jackson. That was wonderful. Really appreciate all of that. With the folks that are here, are there any questions that we can field for Dr. Jackson on the content or of his presentation or anything else related to his research? And if you could put those either in chat or Q&A, we'll be happy to share those. We have about 8 minutes or so here, so we have plenty of time to answer questions.
So one of the things to keep in mind is these are hard topics. These are not easy topics. There's no right way of fixing it. There's no right way of having the conversation. It's just got to be intentional. If you're going to have it, intentionally have it. Set up a system where you have a clear goal of why you're having this conversation, who's going to be involved, what's the outcomes, how do you measure the outcomes? If you're going to teach it in a classroom setting, do the same thing. How's your class made up? Who's going to be involved? What's your outcome of talking about race? How do you measure what's going on? How do you give students the tools when they get out of that classroom to navigate that subject matter?
Well, I'll ask one just to kind of get folks started while they're thinking about questions they might be interested in. I think we probably, the folks here, and hopefully the folks that'll watch the recording of this are probably teachers. And so in your mind, what is a good historical question to start with to have those conversations where we can meet in the middle as you were talking about? What would be a good sort of
define race? What is race in your mind? Define it. And know as a teacher that your kind of baseline is to kind of move the discussion to having folks understand that race is a social construct, if that's not what's said.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, we're not born seeing each other through racial lenses, but just have folks define race, define it in their own minds. What does that look like? So that's where you start.
I think what I really appreciate is that for a lot of teachers, that's probably like a very scary conversation to have with students, right? Like,
absolutely.
But I really appreciate from your work this idea that it's where we should start, though, is to have that hard conversation, because that's what moves us to a place where we can start understanding one another and having important conversations about these historical concepts.
I totally agree. It's just, and that's why, again, I use films and I use technology, and I particularly use baseball. I mean, you can use anything. Me, it's baseball because it kind of disarms the discussion of race.
Mm-hmm.
You just, I mean, baseball, it's like Americana. And so you kind of sneak it in during the discussion of baseball. Like, what's your favorite baseball team?
Mm-hmm.
And then you kind of can bring it in that way because it disarms folks.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the main reasons why I used 42 or any baseball kind of analogy, because it disarms folks.
Mm-hmm.
But race is so part of baseball. History of baseball. I teach a class on the history of baseball. It defines the nation.
Yep. But it's such a good point, right? Like that we need to be really cognizant of how we can use things that we're interested in as historians, and what students might be talking about in their everyday lives as a mechanism for having these conversations, right? Like,
absolutely. The tricky part now is social media, because I'm not in that world as much as I should be. So I'm not really sure how to interrogate social media, because everybody becomes an expert just because they have access to social media, which is not true.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know how to grapple with that. But I'm grappling with it. My students help me grapple with it.
Well, as a follow-up to that, how are your students helping you do that? Because I'm curious, and I think probably our audience could really benefit from what you're learning about how to grapple with social media at the collegiate level that maybe K-12 teachers could also work through.
That it's a powerful tool to communicate intentionally or unintentionally how young people feel about a particular topic.
Mm-hmm.
That's as far as I have gone with it, because it's like that simple piece of how many likes you have on Twitter, and it really gets into the consciousness of young people sometimes, that whole click like.
Mm-hmm.
Even from people they don't even know.
Mm-hmm.
and so that's what I mean. It's so powerful, and I don't know why, but it does. It's just we're in that era where or you have all these followers, and you don't even know these people, but they follow you. Like, it becomes important to be liked. It may be a manifestation of a changing family structure, changing community life, a different religious structure, educational systems that's kind of changed over the years. So as I tell folks when I teach a class in my Sunday school, it's people want to be, particularly young people, but everybody, they want to be liked. They want people to like them, and they want to be in groups. People don't like to function as individuals and isolated. And so how you navigate that in social media is a whole nother ballgame. It's just, there's no way of doing, there's no right way. It's just what it is. It's a good marketing piece. I mean, I use social media and market stuff all the time.
Right. But that raises a really good point, right? Like if this concept of sort of needing likes, the vulnerability that comes along with that can be really tricky when you're dealing with hard history, like concepts of race or historical events that maybe students might be unsure of. And so I think what you presented tonight is a fantastic framework for starting those conversations. And so thank you for that.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's just that social media is a space that I have no answers for. And I look to my students, and there is no way I could have a detailed drilling down conversation about race on social media. There is no way. It's just, it's too complicated. Plus I'm a expression reader, body language. Because people can agree with things without even saying it with body language and facial expressions.
Well, and again, that gets at one of the things that we really appreciate most about history and history writing is an appreciation for nuance, right? And that matters, and that's hard to convey through the social media arena, as you mentioned. Well, I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So thank you again to Dr. Eric Jackson for your engaging presentation tonight. This has been truly wonderful, and we at the National Council of History Education are grateful for your presentation. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And also thank you to all our participants for joining us for our webinar. We hope that you enjoyed Dr. Jackson's presentation. If you'd like to have access to more of our resources or just want to find out more about what we do or how you can be active in our organization, please visit us at www.ncheteach.org or follow us on Twitter, which is @HistoryEd, or our Facebook and Instagram pages. If you have questions or comments, I can be reached at matt@nche.net. And thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. And we look forward to seeing everybody tonight, or excuse me, everybody in the future. So thanks to everybody again.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.